Matt will, of course, follow up, and then we'll open up for conversation. Cool. So, Steiner starts out this lecture by just reiterating that, of course, follow up, and then we'll open up for conversation. I always forget to mute myself. That one of the intentions of the lecture cycle is to show concretely, he says, the justification for certain expanded modes of cognition. And I think I would describe, once you get to the end of this lecture, you could describe what he's speaking about in particular here as an expansion of our mode of cognition to include what he describes in other places as the rhythmic aspect of our being. So trying to perceive the earth and cosmic connection between through the organ of our rhythmic system. So, beyond just what we can perceive with our senses or the extension of our senses through different technological instruments and mathematics. So he says, so that not only a part, but the whole of our human nature becomes the regent for a deeper penetration of the heavens. And so he poses this question: is there anything that we can look to in human history or human evolution that might give us some cues as to this interfacing of human evolution with extra-telluric or celestial activity? And he says yes, especially what transpired in European history, at least in what is referred to as the Middle Ages. So he's talking about specifically between the 14th and 16th centuries, and in the history of ideas, what is referred to as the Age of Scholasticism, where there was this sort of, as it's told, this debate between a group of philosophers called the nominalists and a group called the realists, which, if you're not familiar with this moment in the history of ideas, the realists are maybe kind of inverted in their way of thinking at that time in comparison to what tends to be called realistic today. So the realists were more, I would say, a continuation of a kind of Platonism. So they held that concepts or the ideas that we think with, that words reflect, have a kind of reality, whereas the nominalists, they argued that, and I'm simplifying, of course, but that ideas, concepts, words are just conventions that we make up in order to go about our lives, and they don't reflect any kind of, what our thinking is not really taking hold of anything real. It's interesting, this is our third book study, and before this we read The Philosophy of Freedom, and before that we read The Riddles of Philosophy. And in The Riddles of Philosophy, Steiner was describing how at this point in the evolution of consciousness, at least in what is called the Western world, there's like the self-experience in the sort of active thinking is really starting to kind of awaken. And so Steiner describes, at least in the history of ideas at this time, some phenomena that we can look to as far as what was welling up from human souls in human evolution at this point. It was reflected by what's called the ontological proof of God. So this sort of, which suggests that there was no longer, for some people at least, a feeling for the existence of God, and this need for a kind of a way of accounting for it conceptually and making an argument for it, and this desire to secure it through this sort of self-activity of thought. And Steiner, in different lecture cycles, he mentions a friend of his who he thinks of as a neo-realist. This example that his friend gave, who is this thinker? Vincent Nauer, just making this argument based on like, well, there's got to be something real to the concept or the idea of wolfness, because if you imagine, only feeding a wolf sheep for a certain amount of time, it doesn't change. If everything was just sort of, I guess if the forms of things were just sort of conglomerates of matter, why wouldn't the wolf change into a lamb if all it ate was lamb? So anyway, I just thought that was interesting to see that here as well. So that's a kind of, an argument, at least I guess in the 20th or late 19th century, for a kind of realism to the concept of wolf. So for him, again, Steiner, this testifies to something new that was coming in, at least in the Western world, in the evolution of consciousness, and also something kind of fading away. Barfield, I think, would describe this as the withdrawal of participation. So that kind of where like the ideas or the concepts or the meaning that we experience in the world was sort of freely given. And now there's this sort of, this new thinking on behalf of the I. And so Steiner says that this, he places this period, this development, as a midpoint between two extremes, 10,000 years back and 10,000 years into the future. These endpoints represent time periods in which especially intense activity of human life, he says, could not happen, because they correspond at least 10,000 years ago from that point, the Middle Ages, to an ice age, points of time representing a certain barrenness and death of civilization in the very regions where human life experienced such turmoil, at least at that time, in thought. So yes, he refers to 10,000 years back from that time as the maximum development of the ice age. And I'll get into a little bit more of what he says was going on at that time toward the end of the summary. But he also, I don't know if this is the case so much today, like in academia, but at the time he was speaking about the reluctance of philosophers to consider this period in the history of ideas. But he says we're living with the after effects of the turmoil that welled up in human souls at this time. And so he describes, from this actually kind of going back to the 8th century BC, and then this whole period as a kind of upheaval. And I wanted to share this graphic that Owen Barfield's grandson, Owen Barfield, created that depicts these different what Steiner calls post-Atlantean epochs in the evolution of consciousness. So this whole upheaval period that Steiner's referring to consists of this whole kind of yellow portion down here. So if you look to the left, 750 BC to 1450, as that kind of midpoint, or I guess a little bit further up, the midpoint of the whole development being, for Steiner, the incarnation of Christ. And so for him, as we explored in the past in the riddles of philosophy, this is reflective. These changes reflected in the history of ideas reflect the kind of intensification of the experience of what he refers to as the I, consciousness of the ego. And so he contrasts this with what I guess can be gleaned from looking at the language of the Greeks, where the I, or the ego, was not as separated from the verb. The subject was not as separated from the verb in the way that things were expressed. And he describes this, that the way they took hold of the phenomena with their intellects is still relatively selfless. So in the riddles of philosophy, he would describe how the Greeks experienced ideas in their perception. So they perceived ideas rather than thought them themselves, as he describes it. So there's this gradual kind of polarizing happening between perception and thought. And then he further contrasts this with the period further back than that, which he refers to as the Egypto-Chaldean age, where he says humanity was not yet relating to external phenomena to one another through any kind of intellection. Instead, people apprehended the world right down to the compass points via feeling and direct perception. And he says, I think this is a great sort of succinct summary of that. He says the concept was not yet separated from sensation, which I think also kind of refers back in a way to the philosophy of freedom. Yeah, and then he kind of goes further into the state of consciousness, what Barfield would describe as original participation, even further back, where human beings were just so bound up inwardly with the outer happenings that they would have experienced themselves as we experience our limbs as part of our body, as part of the earth. And so then going back to this, the Middle Ages as the midpoint between two Ice Age periods, he says that this 10,000 years back from the Middle Ages would have been the period that he refers to as ancient India, and that the Ice Age would have created conditions at that time in India that resemble more the conditions that we experience in the temperate regions today. And, he emphasized in the past lectures of this lecture cycle how I guess it's important for a certain kind of development, or that temperate regions afford for a certain kind of development that isn't as possible in the extremes of the tropical and polar regions. And then he goes into this reflecting the larger rhythmic process of the precession of the equinoxes, which he ties to this evolution of consciousness depicted by the interchange of these different ages. And then he brings that into connection with this characterization of, or this, I guess, approximate description of how many breaths a day that human beings would typically take on average, having a correspondence with the amount of years that it takes for this whole precession of the equinoxes, which is also referred to as the Platonic world year, or the great cosmic year, to unfold. So again, yeah, just grounding this perception of rhythm in the cosmos in our very organism. So I'll stop there. I've said a lot. Matt, would you like to follow up before we open up for conversation?
Yeah, just to highlight that essential point of this chapter is that the constellations of human faculties, as Steiner puts it, change through the ages, just as the precession of the zodiac, as the sun, where the sun rises on at the beginning of spring, processes through the zodiac. That there's this correspondence, and I love that Amrine chose to translate. I couldn't help but mention that he chose to translate the German neologism for Wachsensein, if I'm pronouncing that hopefully closely correct, as concrescence, which is this Whiteheadian term to grow together into being, to describe the way that, especially in earlier ages when there was much more participation going on, but even still today, because of this correlation, this correspondence between the constellation of our human faculties, everything down to the way we perceive color, right, is shifting as we process through the equinoxes. And so his point is just, look, to understand the nature of these celestial movements, we need to include ourselves and the whole evolution of consciousness, of human consciousness in the picture. Otherwise, we're just playing with toy models. But yeah, I thought you captured everything else pretty well. The realism, nominalism thing I want to come back to, but I'll leave that for now.
Great. Angus, would you like to Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Nice to see you again. Yeah, thanks for that, Ash. And the point about the philosophy of freedom, I think that's going to become extra relevant in the next chapter. It becomes very crystal clear, at least in my mind, what's going on there. I want to start with an observation, and Matt has already sort of like hinted at one of my questions to him, and then I've got a question to Chad. It's like based on it, but I wanted to make an observation which I thought was really interesting. So he says, take Aristotle and Plato, and above all, the greatest philosopher of antiquity, Heraclitus. And you have to, so it awakes that question. Okay, why is he saying that? And I want to come back to that at the end after I've asked Chad the question, but haven't given him a chance to answer it yet, because I think it's really interesting why Heraclitus is so relevant in this conversation, why Steiner's making this very bold statement there. Matt, you picked up on for Vaxensign and congrescence. I'd love it if you'd sort of like talk to us a little bit more about what that means in terms of in the context of this series of lectures, and your deeper knowledge of how Whitehead uses it, because I think it'd be really helpful here. The version on RS Archive actually says union, but I heard congrescence and I thought no, something's going on here, so I had to go back to the German, like you obviously did as well, to check it. So that was the first question to you, Matt. And then the second bit is this stuff about the Platonic year, because this is where things get sort of like super interesting. I've been doing a deep dive into Jung and the Red Book, and he says Jung got fascinated in astrology. I think it was 1919, and actually I can check it because I've actually. But anyway, it's not so important. He started to take a deep interest in astrology, and if anybody's looked at the Red Book and Philemon and the predictions that are going on there, he attributes an amazing amount of importance from the shift from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. And he talks in terms of it is the time when mankind has to confront. It's like the reality of goodness isn't just evil isn't just absence of goodness, but it is actually sort of like a force within itself. And what Jung is doing in this book, he's outlining how the Platonic year, or the Platonic months here, are it's like deeply significant, which also maps into this whole the Platonic year thought that's going on in this chapter. And that led me to the question to Chad, which was to what extent does astrology take into consideration this meta perspective, the vernal equinox? How does that play into it's like modern astrological thinking? Because what Jung is indicating, it is hugely important. So that'd be interesting to hear about that. So coming all the way back to Heraclitus, because also Jung has like a deep connection to Heraclitus, and in the Red Book, I'll just read you this, like the note to one of the chapters. In his later work, Jung gave importance to Ennantio, the principle that everything turns into its opposite, which he attributed to Heraclitus. And this is, I think, this is sort of like one of the threads that's been going on through all 6 of the conversations that we've had so far, which Gopi has been in his reciprocal system. He's also trying to create this dynamic tension between these two opposites, which is what creates movement in the system. but it's like only knowing one side of a reciprocal system means you're doomed to never understand it. It's like the irrational numbers in astronomy, or it's like embryology before. It's like the state of the ovum before fertilization. It's these like incommensurables that are going on there. So I thought this was a really, really interesting chapter. I will mention I thought Steiner was a bit dodgy on his mathematics here. He didn't sit with 10,000 and 12,000 years and Platonic year being 25,920. In my mind, there was a little bit of sloppiness going on there. I don't know if anybody else picked it up whilst they were reading it, but I've already spoken for quite a while now. So I'd love to hear Matt and Chad's answers or any other thoughts that people have.
Hopefully Chad can join us. But yeah, on concrescence, this is Whitehead's neologism. I think it was actually a Latin term, but he sort of brought it back into the English language, having fallen out of use. But it means just to grow together, and it's his way of describing kind of the microcosm-macrocosm relationship, but not just in human beings. For Whitehead, you could say that, I mean, if we kind of blend Steiner and Whitehead, you could say that every experiential creature kind of thinks it's human, or is on its way to being human, or falling away from being human in these different ways. And so every central experience is this process of concrescence being realized from moment to moment, where the entire universe grows together to take a new perspective upon itself. And so when this term is used in the context of the various cultural eras of the earth, there's a sense in which, I mean, it's a very astrological insight that, yeah, the positions of the heavenly bodies are flowing into and constituting in some ways our consciousness from moment to moment. And it's just this sense that there's no divide between inside and outside, or subject and object, that there's, for Whitehead, what is an object in one moment as a result of this process of concrescence becomes part of the subject in the next moment, and that subject enjoys its experience, and then Whitehead would say it perishes and itself becomes an object to be felt and concressed into the next subject, and so on. And so it's just a new way of thinking about subject-object relationships, or self-world relationships, if you want, that's attuned to the participatory nature of these things.
Could I ask a follow-up question? And how would that relate to ideas of like archetypes? Because I hear it's like something similar going on there.
Yeah, that's a bit more complicated. I mean, Whitehead is a Platonist, and so he does have some role for forms in his ontology, though there's, what he calls them eternal objects, which for him are like these pure possibilities that also get concressed, grow into the formation of a new subject. But they're unlike, his eternal objects are not exactly equivalent to Jung's archetypes, because Jung's archetypes are more like these, I mean, there's a sense in which they accumulate over historical time. And they also, according to Jung, have agency in the psyche. They're like spiritual beings in a way. But then there's also this archetype of the self, which Jung relates to Christ, which is more in the future, like pulling us towards it, rather than just being inherited from the past and the collective unconscious. And that attribution of agency to the archetypes is not something Whitehead would grant to his eternal objects or his forms. They're just possibilities that that creatures or conscious human beings can draw upon as we try to characterize and interpret our experience. But there would be another way of talking about archetypes in Whitehead's metaphysics, which I could just say in Whitehead's terms without unpacking it, because I don't think this is the time, or that there's time or this is the place for that. But Whitehead has a dipolar divinity. He's very much like Heraclitus in the sense that everything is polar. So Whitehead has the primordial and the consequent nature of God, and archetypes for Whitehead would be something like propositional feelings and the consequent nature of God. I know that's probably completely meaningless, but for most of you, but maybe sometime in another forum I can unpack what that means. But it's a kind of divine lure. Archetypes would be like divine lures in Whitehead's terms. But yeah, there'd be a lot to unpack there for it to really make sense. But why don't we see what Chad thinks now about these questions?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. You have to excuse me. I literally woke up at the beginning of this. So had it on my phone listening, and I heard my name. I'm like, okay, I gotta get dressed. So really interesting questions, and let me see if I can address them correctly. I think there are different astrologies. Like in India, they use the sidereal zodiac. So they actually use where the stars, the constellations, we perceive them to be at this time. So in the precession of the equinoxes, the sun does no longer rise at 0 Aries the way it did in ancient Greece. Around that time, the sun actually rose around 0 Aries, but now it rises about 23 degrees or 7 degrees Pisces. It's moved backwards through Pisces to where the sun now rises roughly around 7 or 6 degrees of Pisces in the sidereal zodiac. So in the Western system, we literally just move the beginning of spring. We say that on the March 20th, the beginning of spring, the sun rises at 0 Aries, and we just demarcate the tropical zodiac on that point. So the precession is talking about the difference in that relationship. So how different astrologies take in that concept is different for different astrologies. But I very much agree with Jung's kind of emphasis on the transition into the age of Aquarius. And like, I think what astrology represents is a form of logos in the Heraclitean sense. I'm not sure if that's what you were asking about with Heraclitus, but in the sense of it is a form of reason, an ordering principle that gives meaning. Astrology is a way of a language, a way of identifying that meaning, a way of identifying the archetypes within the phenomenon. And I think that's in that sense of what you're describing with the antiandromia effect or phenomenon. In a sense, I think that's what's happening with astrology, is that it wasn't possible for us to have an adequate sense of astrological phenomena until we went through the Copernican revolution and got the correct mathematics that we weren't the center of the system. And then we had to discover the 3 outer planets. And in that same time, it's the differentiation of the modern self, the buffered self, as Charles Taylor described it. And so astrology wasn't ready to perform what it can do, which is be a symbol system that mediates the relationship between human beings and the divine, because we hadn't differentiated and hadn't accurately discovered the mathematics correctly. So how does that touch on what your interest in your question is? I know I didn't answer it fully, so.
Really interesting. You've added to like levels of detail that I was completely unaware of, but I really did. This doesn't have strictly to do with astrology. That's like the bringing in of the concept of the logos, which you mentioned there, which is a Heraclitean idea. I think is also it begins to grow that feeling of why Steiner says Heraclitus is the most important philosopher of antiquity. But no, that's really interesting what you're saying about the need for the new planets to have a complete astrology, if you like. Really interesting.
And it is really interesting that Jung's his emphasis on the age of Pisces had to do with a series of synchronicities that he had with fish and Christ. And I think just to wrap it up, tie it up, I think the whole picture, when I understand what Barfield is saying about this movement from or original participation to final participation, or what Steiner here is talking about, the mythic consciousness that we had prior to the axial period, prior to the 6th century BC, really. Astrology allows us to recover that form of awareness. It's a symbol system that allows us to enter into the interior, the archetypal interior of both the human being and the planets. I think this is exactly what Steiner is pointing us to do, to attempt to do, to try and understand the quality of them rather than just the quantity or the content, the mathematical dimensions of them, right? Yeah.
Thanks, Chad.
Another excellent discussion.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone.
Rosemary, real quick, I just wanted to address Angus's question about the imprecision of the math in Steiner. And so Gopi actually helped me to understand this better, because just this whole, in other lectures, Steiner draws this connection between the amount of breaths that we supposedly take every minute, and then extrapolating that out to a whole day, and that, being the amount of days that, or amount of years that transpires in a whole Platonic year. And in this essay that he wrote about the Avogadro number, he explores different kinds of number. So like there's the kind of more crystalline manifestation of number in crystals, which is a more kind of fixed, regular order, precise, whereas in plants, there's like certain plants have a tendency to have this many leaves, but sometimes there's a deviation from that. There's a kind of living, like with the planets, it's not commensurate. And so Gopi in this essay talks about these numbers as being approximate because it's living. So it's more about perceiving the rhythm rather than the exact equivalence of the amount of breaths that we take in a day and the amount of years that transpires in a whole Platonic year, because also the zodiac sections aren't equal either. So I think thinking into even, this may not address exactly like if the math there is imprecise, just in the calculation, but I think overall, like what he's gesturing towards is a perception of rhythm, which he's mentions at the end, is missed in this emphasis on the quantitative and just searching for kind of these abstract relations. I don't know if that addresses fully your question, but
sorry, Rosemary, I know you've been waiting a long time. It was actually this is about the 10,000 years, because even there, it's like the halfway point, it doesn't match. So, I mean, we don't need to get stuck in the details, but he also makes a similar error in the next chapter when he starts talking about the speed of sound. So perhaps we'll revisit this this topic at a later stage. It's not a mathematical error, but he's making assumptions there that, he's a man of his time, if you like.
Good to spot those. Rosemary?
I wanted to get everybody's idea of what they understand by the term that Steiner uses right at the beginning. Not only a part, but the whole of our human nature becomes the reagent for a deeper penetration of the heavens. Ashton pronounced it Reagent. I don't know if that was a mistake or whether you didn't get reagent. I'm not familiar with that term. I don't believe I've seen it in Steiner before. So I'm wondering where it comes from. Is it from chemistry? And the way I'm understanding it now is more and more conscious participation by humanity in all of these processes ongoing. Like Matt, you were saying earlier, human consciousness is now a factor that's going to be factored in more and more as we go forward. Is that how you understand more of humanity as a reagent?
It's like, if I think Steiner's using this analogy to say, look, we've got this physical setup with our contemporary physical models of the universe, and we haven't yet added this human element, this human reagent, to catalyze a new kind of reaction. And as soon as you add a little drop of, I mean, not that the human is just a little drop, I mean, in some sense we're the whole the whole thing, but without that reagent added, the chemistry of the cosmos looks very different. And as soon as you add a drop of the human being, all of a sudden the entire thing is transformed. I think that's what he's suggesting with that metaphor, but I'd be curious how others took it.
Thanks for bringing that out. Yeah, I totally made a mistake. Much more interesting that way.
Yeah, it's an alchemical metaphor going on there for sure. No one else has anything. I wanted to go back to the nominalism, realism discussion. I mean, Steiner's just throwing in these tidbits about the evolution of consciousness, I think, to illustrate the shift in cultural eras that corresponds to the shift in the precession and the zodiac. But it strikes me that there's a need, in our age to think very deeply about that dispute during the scholastic period in the Middle Ages between the nominalists and the realists, because it's very interesting how nominalism nowadays takes on a very different form than it did than what was motivating it back in the scholastic period, which was really this deep sense of the power of God, and a desire to not allow God's power to be limited, such that God could have created the world any which way, and there even the forms were not impositions on the power of God, right? Whereas the realists wanted to say, no, God can't make 1 + 1 = 7. And as in Plato's dialogue, I'm blanking on the name. It's one where he asks about ethics and the nature of the good, and the Platonic position is basically that God is good because it's good. The good isn't good because God says so, right? Whereas the nominalists would want to reverse that and say, whatever God does is good. And in our time, though, the example that Steiner gives about the wolf and the lamb, that clearly there is some kind of formal reality participating in the biological world, in the physical world, that distinguishes the wolf from the lamb. But there's a way in which idealists can go too far here. And there's an interesting dispute between the 19th century, early 20th century British idealist, F.H. Bradley, Francis Herbert Bradley, and Whitehead, where Whitehead was very influenced by Bradley, but Bradley uses this example of the wolf and the lamb, and I'm sure, Bradley was getting it from earlier thinkers. Maybe that particular example goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, I'm not sure. But in Bradley's view, he's an absolute idealist, right? And so this idea that there are particular wolves and lambs, like individual beings that have their own inner lives and whatnot, gets kind of backgrounded or almost erased by this absolute idealist position. And all that's real are the universals. And that's kind of a more caricatured kind of Platonism. I don't think Plato has so many different positions that he voices in his dialogues. So I wouldn't just say that's Platonism. It's a oversimplified form of Platonism. But in Bradley, the universals, the ideas take preeminence over anything else. And Whitehead's point in response to Bradley is that, no, look, when a wolf eats a lamb, that wolf ate that lamb, right? And the wolf knew it, the lamb knew it. He says the carrion birds knew it. And so that there's an actual particular concrete happening, an actual occurrence that can't be reduced to just the forms. And so there's a way in which it's very easy, as anthroposophists or Platonists, to want to be like, oh, well, we're realists, obviously. But there's something more to nominalism, and there's a way in which I think we have to hold the tension between these two positions a little bit better to avoid just derealizing or erasing the significance of particulars, because you need the particular and the universal to get the individual. So I just wanted to mention that as not really relevant to the astronomy piece, but just in terms of the evolution of consciousness, that I think we want to avoid collapsing on either of these two medieval positions, as much as our culture is dominated by nominalism nowadays. And so there might be a need to kind of overemphasize the realist position to bring balance, we don't want to just be realists. I think there's something important about the nominalist position as well.
Can I ask something real quick about that? Because I think you mentioned it earlier. That's kind of the difference between what Steiner was saying, that before we saw picture consciousness, is that the way he described it? And then we get concepts come afterwards. Is that right? And I think that's what you're actually just
gets separated from the perception in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, the perception. Yeah. It seems like that's in a sense what you're describing there, in that a movement from realism to nominalism, in a sense. It's like we had to do this indwelling to get the particular, to get the individual, to get the I. But now we have to move back to be able to see
it's
the
like
spirit world again. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of like we need a second axial turn, to recover the immanent, not to lose the transcendent, and not to lose this ability to freely generate our own concepts, which is what nominalism allows us to do.
And this is where, like, I feel like astrology is just like this this vehicle. It's a methodology that helps perform that function. But at the same time, I don't want to like put too much on it, because you don't want any one thing to be like the linchpin of a new axial era or something. You know what I mean? That's why I think Rick is really careful about not saying, hey, look, astrology.
Yeah, I don't
really go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't think Steiner's advocating like a kind of exclusive realism. I think he was just pointing to that as like a kind of testament to what was like the transformation that consciousness was undergoing.
Oh yeah, I know he's not. I mean, certainly Goethe was very attuned to the particular and finding the archetype in the particular. So yeah, I wasn't saying Steiner was at risk of doing this. I just wanted to emphasize the point.
Awesome. Karsten?
Yeah, interesting point you made there, Matt, about us having to hold this tension between realism and nominalism. I think we also have to consider the fact that behind this debate, there are also different concepts of God. So it's also the struggle between voluntarists and intellectualists. And I think also there we need some kind of tension, because we want somehow to be able to communicate or understand God, but also we need to maintain this perspective of a consciousness that has to evolve to kind of reach this state of dialogue with the Godhead. We don't want it just to be an purely intellectual relation in a modern sense of the word intellectual, where it means use of intelligence. We need to have this idea of a broadening of our consciousness and our conscious experience of the world. So, but also there's some kind of continuity between this idea of things being what they are simply because God wills it, and the modern concept of things being accidental or arbitrary. You could say it's kind of the same structure. You just took away this God that moves in mysterious ways. So now it's just existence in itself that moves in mysterious ways. But in a lot of ways, it's the same kind of structure or conception of the universe. Yeah, of course there are also differences. I agree on that, but I see voluntarism and nominalism kind of preparing the way for materialism and atheism and so on. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, with the shift into the age of the consciousness soul and the rise of modern science and the Enlightenment and everything, what the power that had been given to God by the nominalists becomes the power of man, right? And so we make the laws, we make the rules. Language is just the source of order in nature, and we impose that order and all of these things. Go ahead, Angus.
Yeah, a reflection and a question. The reflection is another very interesting part of this particular lecture, is when he's talking about blue and violet, and he says that indeed the sensation of dark colors can be seen to have arisen simultaneously with the capacity for intellectual concepts. So going along with this idea, it's like moving into a new Platonic month, or it's like these leaps forward that we make in our progress, or in consciousness, in the development, in the evolution of consciousness. You've also got it happening at a sensational or sense impression level, and that also awakens in my mind this idea that's often the talk of the new etheric vision. Will we, in like several hundred years, be recognizing that this is when a new capacity to see that previously didn't exist? There's a similar notion when Steiner talks about the development of consciousness. So is it conscience, not consciousness, conscience, that if you look at the Greek playwrights, you can see there was a period around about 400 BC, the word conscience didn't exist for the Greek playwrights, and then within 100 years people are starting to use it. So this idea, the old idea of the Furies or the Erinyes, who's like came to castigate man for his evil doings, it's like it was gradually expunged from society. So that was just a reflection on that little bit of the text. The question is, you both, you Matt and Chad, used the term axial age, and Steiner also multiple times talks about, yep, we're always at turning points of time. In history, the important thing is to recognize, what is it that's changing? I just like to hear your thoughts on the use or the overuse or the underuse, I don't know, of that terms, like an axial point, I think was the term you used. I can't remember.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it originates with Karl Jasper's trying to think about this period between about the 8th century BCE and the 4th century BCE or so, where across all continents, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Socrates, Buddha, Moses, there's like all the prophets in the Old Testament. There's this new orientation that human beings are taking toward the transcendent, rather than a sense of morality coming just from the social group. There's this breakthrough to a sense of, no, I as an individual have a connection to something beyond just my group. There's a universal good. It applies to all human beings and so on. That's the first axial age as far as Jaspers is concerned. And then more contemporary scholars like Ewart Cousins, Thomas Berry, and others have talked about a second axial age, which includes this transcendent axis, but also recognizes that there's an immanent frame, there's a community of life, there's a need to to recognize our immanent relationships with other beings on this planet, and not just be vertically oriented, because the idea would be from these contemporary scholars that this initial axial orientation towards the transcendent led to this kind of up and out religious view that like the earth is a temporary sort of journey, and the idea is to get off of it as soon as possible, and so we need to balance that with a second axial turn would be the idea. I don't know if Chad wants to add anything. I know he's studied Bella's work. Robert Bella also talks about this.
Yeah, that was great. I think the point that Rick really emphasizes in the axial turn is that it's where the split between the human being and the divine, or the world and the divine, really comes into being. So like the Buddha describes samsara and nirvana, or Plato describes the phenomenal world and the archetypal realm, that there's this differentiation, a dualism. And ultimately what the second axial idea would be is to overcome that dualism and to realize the unity. I think that's one simple way of describing it. And I think astrology kind of does that. It's like a symbol system that unites the interior, the archetypal, and the phenomenal, the real and the nominal, actually, because every moment in time, every person has a birth chart, and then that has an ongoing relationship. It's a concrescence, and then there's an ongoing process, relational phenomenon that you or every event has with the flow of time. And astrology is a map that allows us to see the archetypal energies that are informing it, both spiritual beings and crystalline structures of patterns that, the wolf or the crystal itself.
Can I ask a follow-up question there? It sounds like what you're describing is fairly close to Gebser's Mythical Age. It's like the transformation, but of course he's got two that predate that, the archaic and the magical. Do you agree with that? That it's similar to Gebser's Mythical, or are there like big differences?
No, from what I understand, I would say yes. I think it's like the aperspectival that Gebser is describing is a recovery of the magical, the mythical ages. It's a being able to see through it and overcoming the deficient mental, which is what the quantitative dimension is, the mental, deficient mental that recognize an aperspectival perspective that incorporates the mythic. And the magical, in a sense, is like that's synchronicities. Like I think Gebser even describes, when he talks about Jung briefly, he says that synchronicity wouldn't exist in the magical era. It's synchronicity only exists because of the dualism, that we don't think the world should hold meaning and purposes as an agency. But synchronicities indicate that it does. That is what a genuine synchronicity is a communication from the divine, from the transcendent, from the intelligence in the universe to the human being or to any other agent, non-human as well.
Yeah, there's definitely overlaps between Gebser's sense of structures of consciousness and what Steiner is describing in terms of the cultural eras. It's not a perfect one-to-one match in any case. I think there's a sense in which what Gebser calls the mental structure kind of overlaps with the Greco-Roman and the current age, the current era, and what he calls the mythic. It's almost like you can think of Steiner's eras and Gebser's as overlaying sort of in between each of Steiner's eras in some sense. And so it's not a perfect correspondence, but there's definitely a similar morphology at play in both of their perspectives on this. Yeah. I'm going to need to run a little bit earlier today in a minute or two because I have another meeting at 10. Apologize about that, but are there any other thoughts bubbling up that folks want to share? Anyone who hasn't spoken yet? Next week, Alex is going to lead us into lecture 7. Thank you for volunteering to do that, Alex. Well, if we feel complete, we can wrap it up for today. And yeah, it just keeps going deeper and deeper. And as I said, this is the third time I'm going through this, and there's just so much to take in Steiner's really good at recapitulating his whole cosmology in every lecture cycle. So it's nice to revisit some of that in this chapter. But yeah, more good stuff to come. All right, everyone.
Great as well to, have the riddles and the philosophy of freedom behind us as well, to kind of further deepen with these more concrete pictures. But anyway, thanks everybody. Hope you have a great
next week.
Thanks. Bye.